A thin sheet of ancient parchment rests beneath protective glass, its surface darkened by centuries, the fibers uneven, where generations of scribes handled the material and pressed ink into its surface. The writing is compact. Some marks have faded, others remain sharp enough to read. These lines belong to an ancient tradition that speaks about heaven, judgment, angels, suffering, and the prayers of people who wait for an answer that does not come when they expect it. The Book of Enoch is not included in the biblical canon of most Jewish and Christian traditions, and by late antiquity, church authorities had already established boundaries around which books were to be treated as canonical scripture. In 367, Athanasius of Alexandria listed the books he recognized as belonging to the canon, and Enoch was outside that list. The text nevertheless survived. It was preserved most completely in Ethiopic manuscripts, while fragments of several Enochic writings were later discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. That discovery changed the historical picture. Enoch was not simply a much later Ethiopian composition. Aramaic fragments demonstrated that important portions of the tradition existed in the Second Temple period, centuries before Christianity. And this matters when we ask why some prayers appear to receive no answer. The Book of Enoch does not describe prayer as a simple transaction in which a human request automatically produces a visible response. Instead, prayer appears within a larger system of suffering, heavenly knowledge, moral accountability, records, and future judgment. The righteous can suffer, the oppressed can cry out, the wicked can appear to prosper. Yet the text repeatedly insists that human actions remain known and that judgment has an appointed time. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says about righteous suffering, heavenly records, delayed judgment, and why silence does not necessarily mean that a prayer was ignored. If ancient scripture and forgotten religious texts fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from scripture, history, and records. But here's what makes this stranger. The most important evidence is not a modern claim about a hidden translation. It is the ancient manuscript tradition itself. The Qumran fragments show that Enochic ideas were circulating among Jewish communities long before the Christian era. That does not prove every supernatural event described by the text. It proves something narrower and more important. The questions Enoch asks about prayer, suffering, judgment, and divine silence were already being seriously considered in the ancient world. The text gives no promise that every request will be granted exactly as spoken. Instead, it presents a universe in which the answer may be connected to something larger than the immediate request. That is the first key to understanding why Enoch treats unanswered prayer so differently from modern expectations. The manuscript evidence becomes more important when you examine how the Enochic material was preserved. The Book of Enoch, usually called 1 Enoch, is not a single short document written at one identifiable moment. It is a collection of ancient sections transmitted together, including the Book of the Watchers, the Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dreams, and the Epistle of Enoch. Different portions have different histories, and scholars have debated their dates and relationships for generations. The Dead Sea Scrolls provided Aramaic fragments of several Enochic compositions, giving researchers an early witness to material that survived completely only in much later Ethiopic manuscripts. Greek fragments also preserve portions of the tradition. This layered evidence matters because it allows scholars to compare copies separated by centuries and languages. The result is not a secret manuscript that suddenly appeared with a completely different teaching. It is something more interesting. It is a long transmission history in which the central themes remain recognizable. But here's what makes this stranger. The text repeatedly connects human suffering with heavenly knowledge. In the Book of the Watchers, the cries of the oppressed are not treated as meaningless sounds. Violence on earth becomes a matter before the heavenly realm. The language of records appears repeatedly across Enochic passages. Human deeds are remembered, The righteous are not forgotten. Judgment can be delayed without being canceled. This changes the question of prayer. If a person asks for immediate rescue and nothing visibly changes, the ancient Enochic framework does not automatically conclude that heaven did not hear. It allows for a separation between hearing, recording, and final judgment. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. First, the suffering of the righteous. Second, the cries of the oppressed. Third, the heavenly record of human actions. Fourth, the appointed timing of judgment. The first part is important because Enoch does not claim that righteousness guarantees immediate comfort. The righteous may endure suffering while waiting for justice. The second part expands the issue beyond individual prayer. Human violence produces cries that reach the heavenly realm. The third part explains why delay does not erase responsibility. If actions are recorded, they remain part of the evidence, even when years pass. The fourth part establishes timing. Enoch is deeply concerned with ordered periods, heavenly movements, seasons, and appointed times. The same worldview is applied to judgment. The human request may exist in the present, while the response belongs to a future moment. That is why the text does not present silence as simple abandonment. It presents silence inside a larger structure. The modern reader can easily miss this because we tend to measure an answered prayer by visible results. If the person recovers, we call it an answer. If the door opens, we call it an answer. If the danger disappears, we call it an answer. But if nothing changes, we often conclude that the prayer failed or was never heard. Enoch introduces another possibility. The answer may not be defined by immediate intervention. The text repeatedly places human experience against a larger heavenly record. The righteous suffer, but their condition is known. The wicked act, but their actions are remembered. Judgment appears delayed, but the delay is temporary within the structure of the text. This is not a promise that every person will eventually receive exactly what they requested. Enoch does not provide such a formula. It gives a different explanation for why visible silence cannot automatically be interpreted as divine absence. Here's what the translators left out. There is no reliable historical basis for claiming that modern translators removed one secret sentence that reveals a supernatural mechanism for unanswered prayer. The more important omission is contextual. When isolated lines about prayer or suffering are separated from the surrounding discussion of judgment and heavenly records, the ancient argument can appear much simpler than it actually is. Read as a whole, the text places prayer inside a moral universe. A request is not a command. Sincerity does not control the timetable. Human beings do not possess the full record. This becomes especially clear in passages dealing with the righteous and the wicked. The righteous can wait, the wicked can continue for a time. Yet the text insists that both are moving toward judgment. The suppression starts at the boundaries of the biblical canon in late antiquity. Athanasius of Alexandria's festal letter of 367 is one important landmark in the development of Christian canonical boundaries. Enoch was not included among the books he listed as canonical. That does not mean a universal decree suddenly destroyed every copy of Enoch. It means the work occupied a different position from the books that became standard scripture in many Christian communities. Over time, the complete tradition survived most strongly in Ethiopia. Centuries later, European scholars began examining Ethiopic manuscripts, and 19th century translations made the work more widely accessible. Richard Lawrence published an English translation in 1821, helping introduce Enoch to a broader English-speaking audience. Then the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries provided an older physical witness. The Aramaic fragments showed that Enochic literature had been copied in antiquity. That evidence forced scholars to distinguish between the age of a surviving complete manuscript and the age of the composition itself. The text had survived because communities copied it. The transmission was complex, the evidence was fragmented, but the central themes remained visible. heavenly judgment, human suffering, angelic activity, records and appointed times. The question of unanswered prayer therefore cannot be separated from this larger structure. Enoch does not promise that heaven will always respond according to human timing. It insists that the human view is incomplete. Now, here's where it gets active. Modern scholarship continues to examine ancient fragments using photography, digital imaging, linguistic comparison, and manuscript analysis. Institutions such as the Israel Antiquities Authority and universities involved in Dead Sea Scrolls research have helped catalog, preserve, and study the fragments. Researchers compare Aramaic readings with Greek and Ethiopic witnesses, looking for changes introduced through copying and translation. This work does not establish that Enoch's supernatural descriptions are scientifically proven. It establishes something historical. The ancient tradition can be traced through multiple manuscript witnesses, and its ideas belong to a genuine ancient intellectual environment. That distinction matters. We do not need an invented missing artifact or a secret modern laboratory report to understand why the text remains important. The manuscripts themselves provide the evidence. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying the Book of Enoch proves that every unanswered prayer is secretly stored in a supernatural database, or that every request will eventually be granted. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a more defensible conclusion. Ancient Jewish writers could understand prayer and suffering within a framework of delayed judgment, heavenly observation, moral responsibility, and a future resolution that human beings could not control. That idea appears repeatedly enough to deserve attention. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the text repeatedly describes the cries of the oppressed, then suffering is being treated as something that matters. If it repeatedly describes heavenly records, then human actions are not portrayed as disappearing without consequence. If it repeatedly places judgment in an appointed future, then delay is part of the system. And if righteous people are shown waiting rather than receiving immediate rescue, then the text itself rejects the assumption that unanswered prayer automatically means rejection. The conclusion is not that Enoch gives us a secret formula. The conclusion is that Enoch preserves an ancient explanation for divine silence. The person praying sees one moment. The text asks the reader to consider the entire record. That is a major difference. In modern language, we often ask, why did nothing happen? Enoch's framework asks another question. What if the absence of immediate change is not the same thing as absence of judgment? That does not solve every tragedy. It does not explain every unanswered request, but it does explain why the text spends so much time describing records, witnesses, appointed times, and final judgment. The answer is not always portrayed as an event that happens immediately after the prayer. Sometimes, the answer exists within a process that the person praying cannot see. This is why the ancient material remains uncomfortable. It refuses to reduce prayer to a transaction. It does not say that a sincere request creates an obligation for heaven to deliver a specific outcome. Instead, it places prayer inside a larger order in which human actions, suffering, and justice are all remembered. The righteous may still wait. The oppressed may still cry. The answer may still be delayed. But the text insists that delay is not equivalent to erasure. The record remains. The judgment remains. The appointed time remains. And the reader is forced to confront a possibility that modern expectations often avoid. Perhaps the unanswered prayer is not evidence that nothing happened. Perhaps it is evidence that the answer cannot be measured by the moment in which the prayer was spoken. The final part of the argument is therefore not about proving a hidden supernatural mechanism. It is about understanding what the ancient text actually does with silence. Enoch repeatedly places human beings in a limited position. They see suffering. They experience injustice. They ask for intervention. They do not see the complete heavenly record. They do not know the appointed time. They cannot observe every consequence. That limitation is central. When Enoch describes heavenly books, tablets, or records, the imagery gives memory to justice. A person may believe that wrongdoing has disappeared because no immediate punishment followed. The text says otherwise. The action remains known. The righteous person may believe that suffering has been forgotten because rescue did not arrive. The text says otherwise. The suffering remains part of the record. This does not mean every person receives the earthly outcome they wanted. Enoch does not make that promise. Its argument is more severe. It says that visible circumstances are not sufficient evidence for judging the final state of a matter. That principle explains why unanswered prayer is treated with such seriousness. A prayer can be genuine without producing the requested result. A person can be righteous without being immediately rescued. A person can be wicked without being immediately punished. The apparent silence of heaven, therefore, cannot be interpreted from one moment alone. The entire structure of the text pushes the reader toward patience, accountability, and final judgment. The Book of Enoch also complicates the idea that its removal from most biblical canons erased the underlying questions. Those questions continued in Jewish and Christian thought long after Enoch ceased to be part of most standard collections. Why do the righteous suffer? Why do corrupt people sometimes prosper? Why does justice seem delayed? Why do some prayers appear unanswered? Enoch belongs to an ancient stream of literature that refuses easy answers. Its solution is not instant intervention. Its solution is a larger order. That is why the Dead Sea Scroll evidence matters so much. It confirms that these ideas were not invented by modern interpreters. Ancient communities were already copying texts that described heavenly judgment and the problem of human suffering. The surviving manuscripts give us access to those questions across centuries, and when you put the pieces together, the central claim becomes remarkably clear. The Book of Enoch does not expose a secret prayer formula. It exposes a different definition of what an answer can mean. An answer can be delayed. An answer can be connected to judgment, rather than immediate rescue. An answer can exist in a record that the person praying cannot see, and an answer can arrive according to a timetable that human beings do not control. That may be the reason certain prayers seem never to be answered. Not because every prayer is ignored, not because every request is destined to be granted later, but because the ancient text does not measure divine response by human impatience. It measures it against judgment, memory, and appointed time. A thin sheet of ancient parchment still rests beneath protective glass. The surface remains darkened by age. The fibers are still uneven. The old ink still marks the page, where a scribe once pressed words into material that was meant to survive. It is still there, still preserving the language of suffering, still preserving the language of records, still preserving the language of judgment, still describing people who ask, people who wait, and people who believe that silence means they have been forgotten. But the text refuses that conclusion. It keeps returning to the same structure. The righteous suffer, the oppressed cry out, actions are recorded, and judgment belongs to an appointed time. The parchment does not move, it does not answer, it simply remains, and that physical silence is almost the perfect ending for the argument. The ancient page gives no immediate response. It offers no simple formula. It does not promise that every request will produce the outcome a person wants. It preserves something more difficult, a framework in which human beings cannot see the entire record, and therefore cannot always judge the meaning of silence from the present moment alone. The prayer may be spoken today. The consequence may be recorded today. The judgment may come later. The distance between those moments is where the Enochic explanation lives. This is why the text continues to provoke questions. It does not simply ask whether prayer works. It asks what we mean when we say a prayer has been answered. If the answer must always be immediate, visible, and identical to the request, then much of Enoch's framework makes no sense. But if an answer can involve timing, judgment, memory, correction, or a response that lies beyond the person's immediate view, then the ancient text becomes internally coherent. It is not offering a magic key. It is describing a universe in which nothing morally significant is allowed to disappear simply because human beings cannot see what happens next. The manuscript remains quiet. The ink remains fixed. The words do not change. Yet the question remains alive. What if the silence after a prayer is not the end of the matter? What if the ancient writers were trying to tell their readers that the visible moment is only one part of the record? What if the unanswered prayer is not necessarily a rejected prayer, but a prayer whose meaning cannot be measured yet? The Book of Enoch does not give permission to claim certainty where the evidence does not provide it, but it does provide something historically real, an ancient framework in which suffering is witnessed, actions are remembered, justice is delayed, and judgment belongs to a time beyond immediate human control. The parchment is still there, still holding the words, still refusing to give an instant answer, exactly as the ancient tradition preserved them.